Welcome to our live webcast, Navigating a Distributed Workforce, brought to us by Fabella. Thank you for joining us. My name is Rachel Munyaradzi, and I'm with Nika White Consulting, and I'll be providing features of the web event, technology, managing the chat, and presenting the session facilitator. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acquaint you to a few features of the web technology. At any time, you may adjust your audio using any computer volume setting that you may have. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a Q&A chat window. There's a large window which holds all of your sent messages and a smaller text box at the top where you will type in your questions. To send a question, click in the text box and type your question. When finished, click the Ask button. Your questions will be responded to at the end of the presentation as time permits. We're joined today by our session facilitator, Fabella. As a Forbes featured DEI consultant and remote team strategist, Kay has worked with many companies like Instagram, the IMF, Red Hat, and PepsiCo. She focuses on improving inclusive communication between diverse team members to retain top talent, and reduce turnover, and works on building a culture of belonging to prepare companies for their future work. A Filipina American in Spain, originally from Los Angeles, where I am, Kay has lived in Spain since 2010, and she draws from her lived experience as a multi-hyphenate woman of color, a daughter of immigrants, and an immigrant herself to build bridges for belonging. I invite you to review her bio, which can be accessed via the DEI Summit virtual event platform. At this time, I would like to turn the microphone over to our session presenter, Kay, to get us started.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I really appreciate it. And thank you to those of you who are tuning in live today. I guess I could say good morning, but on my end from Madrid, Spain, where I'll be joining you today, buenas tardes, good afternoon. And welcome to How to Navigate a Globally Distributed Workforce. This is a virtual workshop that will help you design your strategies to help you center inclusion for your global workforce in a post-pandemic world. So as Rachel said, my name is Fabella. My pronouns are she, sha, and ella, and I'll be a facilitator today. So our global DEI consultancy, Inclusion in Progress, has team members and client partners that span EMEA, APAC, and the Americas. So I'm excited to share our latest findings on how to navigate a globally distributed workplace with all of you today. So let's go ahead and dive in. All right. So with that in mind, what we're going to be covering today is first, why we must adapt DEI for globally distributed teams to ensure equitable workplaces. This will be a very interactive session, or as much as it can be. Rachel will be helping support reading questions and comments from the chat, so I'll be sure to answer them in appropriate times throughout the workshop. And we really want to make sure today that you walk away with actionable steps. And so as more of a shift to distributed work in the wake of COVID-19, organizations now have an even greater capacity and responsibility to shape our future workplaces and influence global change. So across the globe, there are more visible demands from employees that companies adapt to changing demographic and cultural dynamics, particularly a growing desire for meaningful work that supports employee well-being. So we're going to look at that today. We're also going to look at how the pandemic shifted those expectations and impacted our ideas of flexible work. And finally, some specific ways for leaders to support employees in a remote or hybrid workplace. So with that in mind, just a few quick housekeeping items for today's workshop. First, I asked that you do your best to stay present during our time together today. I know you have a very long and exciting day ahead, and we live in the most distracted time in human history. Believe me, I know I'm a remote business owner myself as well, but we really appreciate you doing your best to stay focused on what we've prepared for you today. So some parts of today's workshop will be interactive. So when we prompt you, we encourage you to use the chat function and type in your comments, and Rachel will be reading them back to me. And we also encourage those of you who are able to keep yourself on mute, minimize distractions for others, and message the team if you'd like to ask for tech assistance. All right. So if that sounds good to you, I'm just going to make sure that everybody's paying attention. And if you could drop an "I'm in the chat, drop it like it's hot. Rachel, are people typing "I'm in the chat"?
I'm getting greetings from South Carolina, but everybody, if you could please put "I'm in." I am typing my "I am in" right now. Yes, Nika White is in.
Yes.
Like it's hot, she said.
Like it's hot. Yes, I'm in like it's hot.
Stephanie is in.
Awesome.
Yes, people are typing.
Fantastic. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started then. So I know you already got the official intro to me, but I'm going to briefly give you a little bit more context for who's going to be leading this workshop today. So I'm a DEI consultant for remote teams, and I'm the founder of Inclusion in Progress, LLC. And we specialize in helping global companies with distributed teams foster cross-cultural inclusion and really prepare themselves for the future of work. And we work with tech companies, the likes of Red Hat and Instagram, and share our insights twice a month on our podcast, Inclusion in Progress, very imaginative, I know, and in our monthly Inclusion Insights newsletter. So as you can see, I didn't put the background today because, I mean, you're literally in my home office. So I think it's also safe to share my non-work bio with all of you today as well. So I'm a US-born daughter of Filipino immigrants who immigrated to Spain herself in 2010. English is my first language, Spanish is my second, and GIF is my third. I don't speak my parents' language of Tagalog just yet, but I am learning as an adult. So the other things you should know about how I got into this work, because I think our stories are so important when we talk about DEI, is that I experienced burnout at the start of my career in 2009. And it is only when I looked back on what led me to burnout in the first place that I realized that I was in a work environment that did not prioritize psychological safety. And it's one of the main reasons I got into DEI work to begin with, because I believe that the ability to share your best ideas as well as share when you're struggling is the sign of a healthy workplace. And we know that we have a long way to go to achieve that. And many of you might have heard this phrase in diversity, equity, and inclusion, speaking about bringing our whole selves to work, which looked a little different and very literal when everyone was actually taking our masks off when we were forced to work from home in 2020. And as much as this introvert really loves getting to deliver this workshop for you from her home office today, we can safely say that this pandemic has actually shifted our ideas of work to begin with. Now, I've been working remotely for most of my career. I have said this actually before we started the presentation today, that because of how long I've been doing remote work, I have a PhD in waist up dressing, which I think all of us kind of had to gain or unofficially went through over the last couple of years. But I understand that being forced to work from home back when it was forced upon many of us in 2020 wasn't the same for everybody. So in the chat, and again, trying to make this interactive, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much did you actually like working from home? So dropping your answers in the chat now. 1 being didn't like it at all, 10 being I absolutely loved it. And I can tell you as an introvert, I was probably a little closer to the 10 side of the scale, if I'm being honest. So I'd love to hear from you all in the chat, 1 to 10. How much did you like working from home during the pandemic?
Greg gives us a 10.
All right, nice.
Rachel definitely gives us a 10. We have things ranging from 10s, 8s, 8.5, 9. We have 1, 6/7.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got a range, I would say from 6 all the way to 10.
All right, thank you, Rachel. Yeah, it's a really good range for us to play with because, I mean, again, it goes to show you we all had such different experiences working from home during the pandemic. And like it or not, remote work, if you're closer to the 10 side or the 6 side, it's here to stay, right? And we're seeing that in workplaces around the world with my team at Inclusion in Progress. So for those of you who answered closer to the 10 scale, hey, I see you. You're not alone. Now that safety measures have been lifted for workplaces, employees are still choosing to work from home. And we know why, right? It gave us more flexibility. It gave us the ability to spend more time with our loved ones, our family members, our pets, to dictate our schedules a little bit more and avoid some of the long commutes that some of us had to endure. Many are actually choosing to work from home for good. In several countries, companies have actually transitioned their in-office roles to being either entirely or partially remote. Plus, job listings globally that offer either remote or flexible work have increased up to threefold since the onset of COVID-19. In December 2021, the careers site Ladders predicted that 25% of professional jobs in North America would be remote by the end of this year, by the end of 2022. And this doesn't even include the jobs that are not technically classified as remote or hybrid yet, but where workers are still at home while employers are mapping out their return to office plans in some cases. Meanwhile, many employees who have been called back are returning to a partially remote or hybrid workplace. So according to Microsoft's 2022 Work Trend Index, some 38% of global employees now work in a hybrid office. And at Inclusion in Progress, we've seen this amongst many of our biggest or mid-range tech firm clients who are going remote or hybrid at scale. But this also brings up an important question, and this is one that I bang on about on our podcast all the time. Most remote work conversations and studies like the ones that you've seen here tend to focus on people in the United States. But what can we learn from the rest of the world? So in some places, remote work just isn't as widely accepted culturally, or it hasn't been embraced by society, or it never caught on due to technological or logistical barriers. So while many countries march headfirst into a work from anywhere future, some workers actually want to return to the office full time. In Japan, for example, teams prefer building in-person relationships with coworkers and customers and clients. Staying at home in Japan actually meant working in smaller spaces. So folks missed out on informal conversations and nonverbal cues, which are very important for building relationships culturally. And in many cases, that actually led to lower productivity during the pandemic. In France, only 29% of French workers said that they work remotely at least once a week. When you compare that to 36% of Spaniards, where I'm based, 42% of Brits, 50% of Italians, and 51% of Germans, France is definitely a bit of an outlier, but that's not really a surprise. No offense to any French people who are here. Now, hybrid work has made some headway in France since last June when it was first instated, but many still prefer in-person social interactions in the office because communication and decision-making are traditionally more spontaneous and informal. Lastly, many teams that are located in companies that have offices in the so-called global South have had to return to the workplace. There wasn't a choice. High-speed broadband and necessary infrastructure isn't as readily accessible in these places. And it makes it more challenging for employees in those locations to transition to fully remote or hybrid work. So whether it's due to things like poor infrastructure, cultural norms of presenteeism, social norms of very defined hierarchies and deference to authority, the response to remote work around the world has been varied. Now, each country's approach, as we know, can be rooted in decades, sometimes even centuries old beliefs. In some cases, predating countries like the United States. So as companies are navigating the pros and cons of remote first, of hybrid, or full-time in-person work, it's important to acknowledge cultural norms outside of our American or even our English-speaking headquarters. But it's not just teams outside our borders that we have to consider. It's also those within our borders as well. So, as I said, there are more visible demands from employees and clients and investors and everyone, key stakeholders alike, that companies adapt to the very clear changes that we're seeing across demographics and cultural dynamics in the United States, particularly due to the demographic shifts with the arrival of Gen Z. According to the 2020 census, in 2019, for the first time, more than half of the nation's population under age 16 identified as a racial or ethnic minority. When you compare them to previous generations, it's clear that Gen Z is more racially and ethnically diverse, more highly educated, and exposed to diverse viewpoints because of the people who were born in their generation. Their personal experiences facing or witnessing discrimination amongst their peers or family members will obviously translate into their own cultural lens and therefore their expectations of their employers, which also includes an increased desire for flexible work to support their career growth. So again, we know that remote work isn't going anywhere. We know that employees want to work flexibly, some of the 10s I'm remembering from that chat, though how often people want to work in an office is going to vary depending on country to country, culture to culture, sometimes even generation to generation. And we know that younger professionals in particular will choose to stay or leave an employer based on their flexible work policy. So we can't discuss flexible work without acknowledging equity, right? The E in DEI. Equity is, in a nutshell, access to the right rooms and the right resources, which will vary widely based on where you are in the world, where you've lived in the world, what information you expose yourself to, where your parents come from, what generation you were born in, and where you choose to work. Now, I often get frustrated because we tend to approach conversations about our global workforce in DEI by focusing on the US first and then acknowledging everybody else. But the truth is, all of our team members are influenced by the larger world too. We work with people with different cultural lenses, whether we're aware of it or not. The people who join our workplaces today have parents, relatives, college buddies, loved ones in different parts of the world. And thanks to many social media platforms, looking at you, TikTok, our team's expectations of work are now globally influenced as well, which means that we as people leaders, as change makers, must design our flexible work strategies with the expectations and needs of our global workforce in mind. So the first discussion that I would love for us to interact with on this workshop today is spending a few minutes discussing and revisiting your flexible work strategy and whether or not you're considering the cultural lenses and global dynamics on your teams. Whether you're fully US based or not, understanding how interconnected our world is and how that shapes our employees' expectations of how they work and when they work was going to be key to strengthening your DEI strategy in 2023 and beyond. So we're going to take a moment to pause here, give you a few minutes to write your reflections of what's come up for you as we had this discussion about whether or not you're considering your global workforce when designing flexible work strategies. So Rachel, I'm going to hand it off to you to read the chat while I take a sip of water.
Absolutely. Thank you. I already have a question for you, Kay. And the question was specific to the countries that you listed, Japan, France, where people preferred to go into the office. And the question was, are those countries not going for the remote option because they already have a very generous PTO and sick time? Could that be one of the factors?
Ooh, that's
versus
a good one.
versus the United States of America, where, our PTO packages are very
Slim.
slim compared to the rest of the world. Maternity leave, all those things, paternity leave, people in the United States, women get 6 weeks, 8 weeks at most after you have a baby. The rest of the world, people get 6 months.
Or
6 months,
years.
a year or two. So
Yeah.
that was the question. Could it be that the people who are not rushing to go to remote work be because they already have a very healthy PTO package, work-life balance?
Partially, yeah. It's funny because some of the tech organizations that Inclusion in Progress works with that are based in the US and Europe, the European counterparts are always like, wait, why are you giving unlimited time off to the US only? What about us? They're like, well, if we give you unlimited time off, you will take it. Unlike the United States, because traditionally, as you said, we don't have very generous PTO packages.
Right.
So I think there's a couple of things there. One is, the point that I was making with those countries, specifically France and Japan, is how we culturally relate to one another. So Japan, for example, is a very collectivist society. There's, even when I've delivered workshops in that environment, I have to physically call on people's names because there is a high deference to authority. And so they actually base a lot of their work interactions on interacting with folks in the office because they can read body language. They're looking for nonverbal cues. They're actually waiting for permission from whoever the leader is in that setting to invite them into the conversation, which is very challenging in a lot of our platforms like Zoom or Teams. France, on the other hand, I would say is a little bit more, I hate to lean into stereotypes here, being here in Western Europe, but I think there's a little bit more of an informal, let's grab second breakfast coffee to have conversations that happen more organically when you're in an office environment. And that's a big part of identity and belonging for a lot of people in France specifically that associate going to the office with their own identity. So I think there's a couple of pieces there. One is, how do we look at it from a relational perspective and either try to design our policies around hybrid or remote to accommodate those things? And then the PTO side of things, when it comes to actually encouraging work-life balance or time off, that's, I think, a larger conversation to address when designing flexible work, because it's really going to depend on, I think the US has, as you've mentioned, quite a long way to go in terms of accommodating time off and caregiving. But, I think it still bears repeating that specifically when it comes to the desire to work in the office and the frequency of returning to the office, how we relate to one another is still very culturally based, if that answers the question.
Yes. Yes, it does. Thank you.
Of course. Awesome. Okay. Any other questions? Wish I could see your faces.
There is a conversation just going on in chat where one of our attendees, one of our participants is saying that they don't have the option to work from home. Yeah. So those are some of the things that are coming up. And some organizations are opting for having people coming in 2 to 3 days a week. And so Purnatoya, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Purnatoya says that that makes it tough to hire people out of state because of that option of having to have people come into the office. And then Bobby says that by default, the nature of my job, I have to work with colleagues across the globe. So we've been thriving with virtual tools as it helps us to be more effective. But I do hear the variety of what's expected in terms of work flexibility. Some are very flexible with work from home and others are still very restricted.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is, yet again, when we're looking at flexible work strategies, just hearing what Rachel has said from you all in the chat and in the comments, it's really important to remember globally. And that doesn't just mean, outside of the United States, but really remembering that even within our borders, the ability to actually design work that works for everybody is really going to depend on the privilege of access to being able to do your job remotely or not. How close you are to the location, whether or not you have access to broadband. Something as basic as broadband for us in the United States is, a real stretch for folks in some parts of the country even, much less the world. So again, when we say globally, the invitation here is really for you to consider that, all of the different nuances in our experiences, especially over the last couple of years, is really going to have to be taken very intuitively and intentionally over the course of charting what flexible work actually looks like, understanding that many people desire it and want to incorporate that into how we work in the future. So again, we hope that this is, I'm already excited for how this is a lively discussion, and I'd love to move on to the next part of the workshop, if that's all right with you all. Yeah?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you all for your contributions. I really appreciate it, and I hope to get to interact with you soon. Again, if you're already on screen and you want to open up a tab, you can find me on LinkedIn, and I'd love to continue the conversation with you there. Awesome. So now that we've looked at the shifting identities and cultural lenses of our distributed workforce, let's take a look now at, and some people already hinted at this in the chat, challenges as well as opportunities, because we have to look at both, of not having everyone co-located or in the same space physically. So for those who loved working from home, for my people, it was amazing that we got to dictate our schedules around our non-work commitments. For employers, it was an amazing opportunity to consider even hiring talent from areas that they wouldn't have considered before. We saw this happen for a lot of Silicon Valley-based tech companies that we worked with, when their existing teams were actually able to move out of a cost-prohibitive area like the Bay Area. And new recruits could actually come from different states, even in some cases different countries, outside their normal pipeline. For those of us who work in DEI, the greatest benefit of flexible work is that when it's designed well, it has the ability to provide greater access to traditionally excluded groups, such as disabled populations or women of color, single parent households, and primary caregivers. But we also saw challenges when we transitioned to flexible work. I say challenges very generously as an umbrella term. Think back to when that first lockdown was announced, right? And you had to cobble together a home office with what you had. And if you're like our clients, your at-home work environment was probably shaped by things like whether or not you had 2 floors, right? Whether or not you had access to a pantry and being able to store extra goods, right? Or even Amazon deliveries. Whether or not you're a caregiver, your partner's or your family's expectations, your physical abilities, your time zone, your language of origin, your specific job roles and responsibilities of whether or not you could do your job fully remotely effectively. Maybe even, whether or not you had time to eat during the day. What else could your work environment have been shaped by? I'd love to hear from you in the chat. These are just some examples. Just thinking back to March 2020 when the first lockdown was announced, what were things that might have affected your at-home work environment?
I'm seeing children being at home, pets, having to work with your pets. Thinking about our conversation earlier on with Selah.
Yes. If you had a puppy or yeah, absolutely. Right.
One of the things, I'm waiting for people to put things in chat. It takes a minute for it to come in. But one of the things that there was an organization in New York that had a lot of millennials. And what they found was the millennials could not actually log into work because a lot of them didn't have internet at home. So, so the company paid for everyone to have internet at home so people could have that connection to be able to log into work. So there are lots of things that people had to consider when the pandemic hit.
Absolutely. Yeah. And exactly like things we just take for granted, like, oh yeah, you don't have internet access at home. Then how the heck are you supposed to connect? Yeah.
From the chat, the ability to have a safe setup, ergo, distractions from spouse,
Yeah.
children at home, kids and husband all working at home, by default, expect you to have food on the table on time.
Oh, yes. I heard that struggle over many Zoom happy hour with my girlfriends. Exactly,
And
right?
one other thing, Jill says, spouse was also working from home, so trying to figure out who works where. And
Yeah, navigating like whose territory is whose. Yeah, exactly. So many relationships tried and tested just by navigating where you're sitting as you're navigating meetings, right? So
Michelle,
absolutely.
my coworker, says, "Oh my goodness, 3 meals a day."
You're a hero. They need to put up a statue to you, Michelle. Next, there's all the teachers, there's all the pandemic workers and the healthcare workers, and there's you, right? Parents, pet parents, caregivers, y'all need statues because woof, that was a hard time. So again, this just goes to highlight the variety even in our own experiences working from home, because unlike a physical office space where things were designed for us to have a uniform work experience, it was very, very different for us working in an environment where any one of these factors, non-work factors, influenced our ability to do our jobs, right? And all of these factors influence whether or not you'll be available to respond to your other distributed team members, because they're also going through those things. They're also being influenced by those same things at any given moment. So with that in mind, statistics show that at any given moment, especially, I feel like this needs to be revisited in our post-pandemic world, but statistics show that you're faced with up to 11 million pieces of information. And your brain can only consciously process about 40 bits of that information at a time. So our brains are awesome, right? But they clearly have a capacity problem, and especially in distributed work. So not only are you trying to navigate all those things we talked about in your work environment, wherever that may be, you are also spending mental energy trying to assess every day how to interact with folks that you see, don't see on camera, or interacting with by email or chat or text across multiple contexts and cultures. Pretty exhausting, right? So the greatest challenge inclusion and progress has seen in distributed work is it's much easier to make up stories when you don't see someone in front of you. I'm going to repeat that. When your workforce is distributed across different locations, it's much easier to make up stories when you don't see a person in front of you. How many of you agree with that? Type that in the chat, yes or no.
Well, one of the comments I didn't read out that kind of alludes to that is bosses expecting you to work odd hours since you're working from home.
Yes, exactly.
You're at home, so you should be able to work. That's kind of making up a story.
Obviously, yeah. There's a screen in front of you, which means work.
Right.
Right, exactly. So do you agree with that? It's much easier to
I'm
make
getting a lot of yeses.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, lots of stories. And if you're anything like me, that story can range from, ooh, I don't want to bother them in case they might be busy. Been there. Worst case scenario, and alluding to that comment about bosses expecting you to work more hours than you should, that story that people make up in distributed work could look like they're never there when I need them. I can't rely on them. I've got to let them go. And those stories or biases can actually dangerously reinforce that same power dynamic or power imbalance that we saw in our pre-pandemic workplaces. So over the past 8 years, these are what Inclusion in Progress has found as the top 3 biases that we've seen come up on distributed teams. Some of them may be familiar if you're, all caught up in your unconscious biases, but a few of them might be a little bit different. So let's take a look. So as we've already seen today, our employees' identities are now so much more than where you come from, your ethnicity or nationality, or even the state that you live in. It's shaped by things like whether or not you live in a city or a town, your political beliefs, whether you've traveled outside of your country or not, where your parents come from versus where you were born, many different things that could be influencing or causing biases when you're working in a remote or hybrid work environment. And the truth is we have a natural affinity for human beings that we identify as quote unquote like us, which is reinforced in a work environment that's distributed. So for example, if everyone speaks the dominant language of the workplace, there may be some inside jokes, which means if you work in a team where, say, most people are German, yes, Germans have a sense of humor, and you're not, there may be inside jokes or shared experiences that you may not understand or even feel excluded by, right? A really good example of this was the recent passing of the Queen of England, where there were mixed feelings, right? So if you were working on a remote team with someone who was from the United Kingdom alongside someone from a former colonized nation of the British Empire, it was an interesting territory, to say the least. And really, it's just acknowledging that there may be differences in what people feel about things when they happen, especially in a non-work capacity, would be a great start. Recognizing that we all have some type of affinity bias and holding space for people to have multiple perspectives on the same thing is really important in distributed work. And this comes back again to having those conversations with your distributed team members rather than labeling those that you perceive as othered or different from you. And it's all about acknowledging that each of us brings our own unique lenses and worldviews and viewpoints to the table, communicating and offering space to discuss those differences respectfully, and recognizing how those differences may show up before making assumptions about one another. So the next is location bias, where we have a preference for working with people who are working in the same geographic location, so the same city or town, country, time zone, more than those who aren't. And this is particularly relevant in our post-pandemic period because companies are all trying to figure out, what does working together look like now? And like I said, there are many great advantages to remote working, but there are also challenges. And some of them we've already discussed today in the workshop, due to location bias in some cases, because we just feel more comfortable when somebody has the same time zone or physical location or same references as we do. An example of this is meeting times, right? Something so basic, but for example, a company I worked with, their head office was in San Francisco, along with most of the team. But the team that we were asked to partner with was actually physically based here in EMEA, across the UK and Germany, which meant that morning meetings in California were always around their dinner time, which is something they shared with us multiple occasions. And teams in the APAC, the Asian Pacific region, particularly folks we've worked with who are around India, Australia, and New Zealand, woof, they often feel like they get the short end of the stick when it comes to meetings, when they're jumping on Zoom calls that are at odd hours in the morning or late in the evening for them. Now, location bias is not just relevant for our teams in different countries. It's also important for those who might consider relocating to a different state or country for a more, in some cases, affordable lifestyle. Whether you're looking at a globally distributed team across borders or watching your teams relocate to different countries or time zones for the first time, just being aware that location bias may happen is the first step to solving it. Just because someone isn't in the same geographic location or area as you, it doesn't mean that they're less capable of connecting and staying on task when you need them. And that awareness of location bias, especially as a team or a leader, means that you can communicate with one another and find, for example, when it comes to meeting times, find ones that suit more of you, or even just consider putting, when you're arranging meetings with your colleagues, save some of us from having to do the -3 or +6 to help us arrange times better, things like that, where you can create better workflows that don't require you having to worry about location as an obstacle or a cause for bias amongst you and your team. Finally, there's something called virtual performance bias. Now, I'm what you'd call a middle-aged millennial. I think I can call myself that. Yeah. So I remember the sound of dial-up. I needed a college email address to join Facebook, pre-Meta, way back when. And I was an avid Instagram user. before I quit the platform in 2018. I know, shocker. Now, to be fair, Instagram was actually one of our clients and they actually loved that I didn't use the platform. So just saying. But I wanted to say that because I know about the stereotypes of our generation's need to perform on a screen, right? And to perform what we're doing on platforms. It's how we communicate with each other socially, and it's translated especially to this distributed work conversation. So what I mean by virtual performance bias is this: how we perceive whether someone is working hard or doing their job is actually often influenced by the very same tech platforms that we use to stay connected when we're working remotely. So, for example, some remote team members might be happy to stay connected on Slack or Teams, whereas others may have figured out, hey, I've got boundaries. I'm going to set some notifications on silent when I want to disconnect after a certain hour, which may be no reflection on how hard they're working. And in our experience, we found that, especially with tech companies, US and UK work culture in particular can be much more hustle driven. This idea of turning off notifications might even in some cases be considered unacceptable, referencing somebody who was saying something in the chat earlier. Whereas in Spain, where I live, some of the reasons I've lived here for 12 years, there's more of a live to work culture. So this idea of turning off notifications, shutting down the laptop after work hours might be considered perfectly acceptable and honestly, I think a little bit more healthy. So we see this sometimes in how cultural differences show up with things like having our cameras turned on or off, right? Like when I deliver training to US-based companies, I don't really have to remind folks to turn their cameras on. It's almost like a standard, it's a given, right? But clients in, say, the Middle East or North Africa and the Asia Pacific region may need a little bit more coaxing to get on camera. And I have to do a little bit of convincing of why it's important for whatever the workshop is. And it's probably for a valid reason that they don't want to be on camera, right? So things like it might be a dinner meeting that they're having, or it's late at night, or they're in their home and they don't really want folks to see their home background. So virtual performance bias could show up in other ways, such as what we assume when we understand that some folks are tech savvy and some aren't. What we assume when some are trying to figure out a relationship with technology that supports their lifestyle and well-being, or what we may assume when others may say have a language barrier, right, to contend with, or they're not as responsive, or maybe they don't use enough emojis on your Slack channel. But being aware of when and where you may be judging people's performance, perhaps unfairly, often unfairly, making up that story, based on your context, based on your communication preferences, is the first step to tackling this. So having a conversation with your teams about their remote work situations, how they like to communicate, if you haven't already done so, can be a really good place to start. So I've talked a lot. I wanted to give this another opportunity for us to discuss. Now that we've gone through these 3 biases that we've found at Inclusion in Progress, I'd love to hear from you in the chat. How can you solve for these types of biases on your distributed teams as you're trying to create more equitable workplaces while folks are working in different areas of the world, geographies, or even their own homes? So, Rachel, I'd love to hear what's coming up in the chat.
Okay, I wanted to kind of highlight something that Bobby had mentioned earlier on. Bobby said that, that his current organization is global and that they've been thriving with virtual tools that have helped them to become more effective. So, yeah, that sounds like an organization that's figured it out. But he says, but I do hear the variety of what's expected in terms of work flexibility. Some are very flexible with work from home and others are still being very restricted. So,
there are so many tools out there, y'all. There really are. And I know that, this technology you kind of have to surrender with, but there really are so many, we've seen from having worked with remote teams for a while now, so many ways that, like Bobby, you can leverage technology to actually create better communication, more transparency, a different style of work that actually doesn't rely so heavily on, the constraints of being in a physical space. But yeah, it does, as we've just covered, bring up some different biases, which I'm sure can, as long as we're aware of them, be things that we can discuss and consider when we're navigating a distributed workforce.
Elvia and Tierney are talking about affinity bias, and Elvia is saying she always tends to be the only Latina in the house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, being the only is a lot of pressure.
Yeah. And Michelle said she had a former colleague in Singapore. The rest of the team was Eastern Standard Time, and she often had to wake up such late hours. It was very painful in order for her to be on the team.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, until there's a time machine, like that helps us figure out time zones. I mean, it's just at least being aware of it made it a point of discussion, hopefully, for that team, for Michelle. But yeah.
Berthine says we have team members perform an internal SWOT analysis to identify their biases and highlight opportunities for individual and team growth. So that is a way to solve for hidden biases on your distributed team.
I love that. Absolutely. Yeah. Confronting it and naming it, I think is a big part of, the things about technology or not being in the same place that hold us back, or we think hold us back, are I can't see and kind of feel you as a person. But communicating that, and actually there's sometimes that I think that it would be nice to have like a t-shirt with a scrolling ticker that just tells you what I need so that I don't have to explain. I know some women can relate. But doing that in that way in a distributed environment actually makes it easier for people to see visibly. And this is actually jumping the gun on another part of the workshop today. It gives us the ability to actually take what might be an invisible conversation and make it visible. And I love that. I think that's a really great way to solve for hidden biases. Yeah. And
Punatoya says open communication and benefit of the doubt.
Yes. +1. Awesome. Okay. So thank you all. We have a little bit more to get through today before we send you off for a very fantastic jam-packed day for the DEI Summit. So we'll get a move on. Thank you, Rachel. Okay, so since the pandemic began in March 2020, organizations went through a much needed culture change as remote work forced us to innovate, to find new ways of doing things. We found ways to stay connected, collaborate despite distance, and in the absence of these physical gathering spaces, we found community on our teams, which empowered teams to contribute to evolving our company culture post-pandemic. So for this portion of the workshop, I'm going to look at some ways that we're supporting distributed teams to stay connected, productive, and effective in a post-COVID world. So the first thing we look at is finding ways to increase transparency, trust, and therefore effective communication between distributed teams. Now, the way that we define what we call working agreements at Inclusion in Progress is something I referred to just now, making the invisible, so behind the screen, visible for all of our distributed team members to know how best to work with us. So when we support working agreements on remote teams, we ask individuals to answer things that would make it easier for them to understand what they need for a successful workday while working remotely. So things like, what are my working hours and non-working hours to establish clear boundaries? What may affect my remote work environment, such as some of the things we looked at, young children at home, living in a city apartment, being in different time zone. Or what is the best method to contact me for things like a brainstorm, for a quick lightning question, or having a difficult conversation, right? And so these working agreements can take many forms, again, depending on, who's on your team, how you're distributed, where you are, a multitude of factors. And this is just one example I wanted to share with you all today based on what our own team uses at Inclusion in Progress. Yes, we practice what we preach. But one of our favorite parts of this exercise is that it doesn't just increase transparency between team members, it also reinforces a self-awareness for each individual, because we realize that all of us may be working for the same team, but looking at these working agreements or working preferences side by side, we can see that we're not all having the same experience. And it's easy for us to just assume, right, to make up that story. And this is a way to mitigate that. This is especially helpful, we think, for managers to adapt their leadership and communication styles as need be. And working agreements are also, we found, very helpful talking points that folks can use to build relationships between colleagues in their appropriate Slack channels or on maybe their Friday happy hours or weekly wrap-up calls over Zoom. Now, these working agreements help both new and current distributed team members understand each other's contexts, which increases transparency and trust. The second thing that you need is to establish rituals that support distributed teams' sense of connection and psychological safety. Now, we often talk about the importance of shared sets of values or norms or behaviors when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion or work culture in an organization. And those need to be repeated and reinforced through actions more than words, as we know. And many of us know what rituals look like through, say, religious services or community activities outside of our workplaces. We can also cultivate those rituals for distributed teams to strengthen that communication and that trust. So the way that we define community agreements at Inclusion in Progress is establishing regular ways to create connection through non-work interactions and rituals that repeat at a regular frequency. It's in the calendar, weekly, monthly, quarterly, whatever makes the most sense for you. We truly believe that trust is built in micro moments of connection, and it's a bank that you can pull from when you need it for when challenges arise on your team. And offering a consistent way for distributed teams to connect outside of work also reinforces the trust that we need to build psychological safety to be able to share our ideas with one another. So when we support remote teams with creating community agreements, we look at things like, what are things that we already do or could do more of to connect as a team outside of our designated work calls? What are asynchronous channels that we can use to leverage better to connect with one another? And how do we rotate responsibility for those channels so it doesn't fall on the same person to lead it every single time? What virtual activities match our team's interests, whether it's, video game nights or book clubs, things of that nature that people can kind of drop in and out of as need be? And how can we potentially connect across departments or functions beyond our immediate team members? So one example that I love and I've used for workshops before is something called the Church of Fail. I hope some of you have heard of this, and if you've not, please look it up. It's amazing. But it's from Matthew Matheson, and the idea is really simple. As a ritual that you can instill on a distributed team, you create a recurring either standing call or a channel where one person is tasked with answering the following questions. The first being, what do you fail at? Or what did you fail at this week, if it's a weekly thing? The second being, how did you cope with that failure? And the third being, what would you do differently? And I love this idea because it's easy, coming back to that virtual performance bias idea, it's easy in a distributed team to want to put our best foot forward, especially virtually, right? But having something like a Church of Fail on a distributed team helps to give us a clearer, more fully human person to understand that we're working with, to help us understand their context and increase our team's resilience. And by doing so, increase their ability to tolerate risk. Now, with all the challenges that companies are facing, I think that's an understatement, it's critical that teams continue to have the space to share their best ideas with one another, even their bad ones. And for a team to be able to innovate, you need to be able to solve problems. And to solve problems, especially ones that your team hasn't faced before, which are many of the things that we're currently dealing with as people and as teams, you need to take risks. So if the people on your team don't know how to tolerate risks or are unwilling to explore options together when they're faced with uncertainty, then how can a team come up with the new ideas that they need in the first place? Without risk tolerance, the ability for your team to work through challenges together, it becomes a huge barrier to virtual teams working effectively. And it's important, we found, for the psychological safety of a distributed team to be able to lean on one another and navigate that uncertainty together. But, and this is a big caveat, increasing risk tolerance should not come at the expense of good behavior or accountability. Because you only feel safe to take risks, especially when you don't see somebody every day, when there is a shared understanding of what is and what isn't acceptable that everybody has agreed to. Which is why the last thing that Inclusion in Progress helps remote teams with is establishing a shared code of conduct for the team that applies to all channels. And if you've been playing with different tech platforms over the course of this pandemic, you understand what I mean. All channels, right? So we discuss things like what behaviors are and aren't acceptable when we disagree. How do we troubleshoot those behaviors as a team? And when do we potentially need to involve either outside mediation or, something else that needs to happen? How do we encourage accountability to ourselves and each other to follow this code of conduct while we're disagreeing? And these are really hard conversations, but the way that I look at it, it's almost like an insurance policy. You really want to have it in place for when the fire happens, not when everything's burning down, right? And so these are actually some of my favorite conversations to have because they tie so well into DEI and really ultimately serve the team in creating a culture that enhances their effectiveness. So a great example of this is one of my favorite longtime remote first companies, GitHub. And you can view their code of conduct here or on their website, which I encourage you to look at after the workshop. What I love about this example is that it doesn't just apply to their own teams internally. They actually share it publicly and they model it for their end users and for the wider GitHub community. And of course, this is like many things, evolved over time. They've had a little bit of practice. And they ended up creating something like this because they assessed what each of their teams needed. They folded in recommendations from their different employees and eventually put it all together in a company-wide policy. Now, not every team will need a code of conduct this detailed. Again, teams are so different because you're all creating a microculture amongst yourselves, but it is important that everyone takes part in creating it. The way that I look at it, again, is like this insurance policy that you need, that your team may not need to see or use every day, but it helps to have as a fallback when fires need to be put out. So in a nutshell, here are 3 ways that we recommend you manage distributed teams. The first being increasing transparency into team members' work and non-work contexts through things like a working agreement document. Establishing team rituals for trust building and non-work connection, which is going to be really helpful for pulling from that bank of trust when you need it for harder times. And you can utilize a community agreement to actually institute those rituals. And then strengthening risk tolerance for psychological safety, which this could be supported by either a team-specific or organization-wide code of conduct that applies to all channels. And that could be posted on your Slack channel, your Drive, your Teams, whatever it happens to be, but it needs to be something front and center for everybody to be able to see after they've agreed to it. Awesome. So we've covered a lot of ground in today's workshop, and I know we're coming up on time, but I just wanted to leave us with a final reflection and hear from you before we wrap up. How can you reimagine equitable work on your distributed teams, knowing some of these methods that we're using at Inclusion in Progress, or maybe some things that you've seen work really well in your organization that you want to share with us? We'd love to know.
So as people type in, there is a question that's come up, Kay.
Awesome.
And that question was that you mentioned earlier on that you were burnt out at the beginning of your career and you didn't feel psychologically safe. Could you share a little more with everyone about that experience and what action steps you took?
Yeah, absolutely. So I left. And this is the lesson, right? If you don't have psychological safety, you risk losing your best people. But I would say, without going into too much detail, my burnout story really shaped not just my desire for seeing equity and inclusion, but also my desire for wanting people to be able to create a life that supported their well-being. So burnout is kind of my umbrella catch-all term for anxiety and depression, which I was diagnosed with both as a result of that experience. And, for me, it was my first career experience post-college. I was, like many folks, in debt because I had student loans, and I wasn't really aware of needing to take care of things like my well-being or my mental health. And so I was working crazy hours, feeling like I needed to prove myself and not really knowing who I could lean on for support. And so that really reinforced for me the importance of, if you don't feel like you know where you can go to when you're struggling, and know that it's safe for you to voice that, then it can actually have dire health consequences. And at least for me, that was the lesson that I took away from it. And so in terms of what I've done, I mean, that's a different webinar for a different day. But I would say one of the ways that I think I've been able to positively channel that into the work that we do now with Inclusion in Progress is, as a remote team, one of our standing conversations is, every Friday in a channel, we share, what's a win we're proud of, what's a lesson from the week. So our own mini church of fail. And what are we doing for our mental health this weekend? And I model not working on weekends, which is very hard for a business owner if some of you all in the crowd have been in that situation. And so really trying to make talking about, hey, it's okay to say like, hey, I actually have a nickname for my depression when she's in town. Her name is Gertrude. I named her after a grumpy English lady. At least that's how she sounds in my head. But when she's in town, I'll say like, hey, I'm going to hang out with Gertrude over the weekend and just, spend some time together. And the team knows, that they can talk about it, or they can share, hey, this is something that's going on with me because I'm modeling that. And so the fact that we can do that on a team and show that we can continue to grow as an organization and advise others on it, really, I think, 13, 14 years out from my burnout story, can do math, 13 years, there we go. It feels like a way forward of, I took the thing that led to burnout. I looked at what the systems were around me that reinforced that and caused that to happen. And I'm trying to lead by example in my daily actions with the team that I have and with the clients that we advise. So another webinar for another day.
Thank you, Kay. Dorothy says, I think knowing more about each individual's personal work preferences would help prevent misunderstanding and miscommunication.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm telling you all this, and I'm showing you a template from our own team, because we've also fallen victim to making up stories about each other. I mean, we've got EMEA, APAC, and the Americas. You've got time zones, you've got cultures, you've got technology just failing, for whatever reason. And so having those pieces in place have really served us as well as a team. And so it was only natural that when it came time to advise other people on it, that we brought those practices that we saw worked for us into the advice that we gave. So yeah, agreed, for sure.
We have a question from Michelle.
Okay.
And her question is, how do you balance having rituals and non-work opportunities to connect with your team and not having it feel like one more meeting?
Yeah, that's the challenge, right? That's the rub. Again, like every team is so different. I think work culture prior to the pandemic was this kind of amorphous, at least for tech companies we worked with, it was the Peloton bikes in the office and the well-being classes that you could hop into, or the fruit that was always there, whatever. And that was company culture, and people would kind of post on that. But I think the challenge and also the beauty of being in the time that we're in is that we now have the opportunity to really look at what that means, and the teams that we're most interacting with have a microculture that we're creating that we can either, share across the organization or learn from. And so I think every microculture, every team's microculture, really it's going to depend on, what are our working preferences? What time can we reasonably give to these things? How do we rotate responsibility for, who's leading this? Some people it's a standing meeting that they just budget in 10 minutes for at the top or at the bottom of the meeting before they go. For some people, it's, making sure that the actual meeting time starts, 15 minutes in to give people a chance to just connect with one another instead of adding more meetings to their time. For some folks, it's a channel that they already use or utilize that people could pop in and out of. And for some people, it's using something completely different entirely. So, it really does depend. But I think, again, it really just comes down to the transparency, the idea of, what does our community, thinking of your team microculture as a community, need? And how do we hold each of us accountable to actually participating in those rituals in a way that reinforces our understanding of one another?
Thank you. Another comment is saying that making sure that everybody has the same equipment, access to the same equipment.
Absolutely. Same equipment. I think somebody said ergonomic setups, which many of us did not have at the start. Whatever folks need to, again, with the input of your team members, wherever they're working, to do their job and connect well without it compromising their well-being. That's going to look very different for different people and different companies, but considering that in your conversations, that equipment piece is very important. Yeah, absolutely. And access to internet, as you mentioned, Rachel.
Yes. Bobby says, to ditto Dorothy's comment, being international with connecting our teams, I hear examples of how to embed it in our normal processes, e.g. church of fail, or some variation of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, when we advise teams, what we always ask first is, what do you already have? Because coming back to that comment about, oh my God, another meeting. I hear you. I get it. Nobody wants to turn into a zombie, a Zoom zombie. Yes, I got dad jokes. You really don't want to add something in that's going to feel too new or too out of the ordinary for a team, especially if you've all kind of spent time together working remotely. You want to try and build into the ecosystem that you already have. So if there's already a standing like Monday call, Friday call, a channel that you're already using, even embedding it into your existing calls without adding more work. One of the things that we also recommend sometimes is giving teams their like a shared calendar, so you could see people's available hours where people could pop in and out of, and based off of those available hours, finding something that works for as many folks as possible. Again, utilize what you already have and try to build that in rather than trying to institute something new for the sake of it. I think that tends to work a lot better in our experience.
So, Kay, I think this is someone you know. Tierney, I don't know if I'm saying her name correctly. Tierney. Kay is the bomb with this. Modeling, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah. Thank you. Hello.
Maddie has a question for us. I'm a recent grad, 24 years old, and the only person representing organizational development and DEI at 1,000+ person company. How do you spearhead mental health initiatives and get support?
Woof. That's a good one. And also congratulations, recent grad, and you're already tasked with leading that. That's amazing. So shout out to you, Maddie. I would say, again, what we permit, we promote. That's a maxim that I use often when talking about, work culture more broadly, mental health, et cetera. So really trying to, again, first model it and really permit others, maybe in your immediate vicinity, to talk about mental health more openly, and leveraging that in, again, your day-to-day conversations, talking to stakeholders, whatever channels that you use to communicate updates from your department. It starts with permitting people to do it, and promoting that mental health and well-being is something that's important for the organization. And sometimes it really does take one person. I think that's, again, why I think it's so exciting that we live in this time. As challenging as the last couple of years have been, we can actually take learnings from one team or one person or one manager and scale it more effectively, because we can see that it works, because all we need is just somebody just tell me what to do. Somebody just tell me what's working for you, and we can try and map it out for others. And it really comes back to, again, you're modeling that in what you're showing people by example. So again, kudos to you for leading that department, and I wish you all the best of luck in scaling your initiatives. But I think it really just comes down to model it yourself, and the rest will come. So,
and also, Kay, sometimes storytelling helps in an organization, especially if you're new, you're the youngest, probably one of the youngest people. And so just sharing stories of what other organizations are doing when it comes to mental health, and sharing with the team stories. Like I think recently I read an article about, it was a young lady, one of the big five, and she committed suicide at the office after an event. So stories like that, sometimes you have to jerk people into reality. So storytelling sometimes, because when you're the one person who is touting DEI, sometimes it's hard. People don't necessarily pay attention to it. So storytelling is also very, very important, Maddie, with that.
Agreed.
I love that, Kay. What we permit, we promote. Thank you for that gem.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, I know we're coming up on time, and we've kind of put questions throughout, which again, I'm big on interaction throughout, because otherwise I'm just kind of talking myself, and nobody really wants that. But I really hope that the discussion was helpful. I hope it gave you some ideas. I wanted to say that I know that this DEI conversation, and you're going to hear from a lot of amazing voices today and a lot of really great insights, it's going to feel overwhelming. I'm going to be straight with you. And I know I felt that way, even as a practitioner myself, right? But again, maybe I'm a Pollyanna, glass half full, I don't know, but there really never has been a more exciting time to contribute to an equitable workplace that works for all of us, because of what's at our disposal. There's something really beautiful about, a blank slate where all of us are kind of throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks, and trying to figure out what we can take with us moving forward. It's for some of us, a very long overdue reset for this conversation. So that equitable workplace, again, I ask you to remember, please, no matter where you come from or where we choose to work, there are different lenses that we're each going to bring to the table. So as you're taking some of these lessons forward into your DEI and flexible work strategies, please consider all the different lenses that may be available, because there really are so many. And again, we're trying to create equitable workplaces that work for all. I know all of you are change makers leading the charge, and I can't wait to follow along. So thank you for sharing your time and energy with me today. And I hope to continue the conversation with you all, either on our podcast, on LinkedIn. You have the QR code if you want to scan that and find me there, or by email, which you also have here on the slide as well. So thank you again. And I'll just, we have a couple more minutes for questions. So Rachel, is there anything in the chat before we wrap up?
Yes. Earlier on, you used the acronym EMDI. What does that stand for?
EMDI. I think I said DEI, but I might have tripped over my words. It happens to the best of us, y'all.
And could you share with everyone, you're working on a book, right?
Yes, slowly but surely. Really trying to distill a lot of the different, again, the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion really mushroomed, as it should have, the last couple of years. But a common frustration we have, because we work with global teams, is how much more the conversation needs to progress across different cultures and different places in the world. So slowly but surely distilling that into a book. So please be on the lookout for that when it's ready.
Kay, how do you manage the different languages you master, especially during stressful or high intensity moments?
I don't know. I considered it a win when with my Spanish husband, I won an argument in Spanish. I was like, yes. That was like my first win. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. I think honestly, it's humility. It's recognizing I can't take myself seriously. And I guess I try to lead with that openness in myself and hopefully invite that openness in other people of like, listen, there's a lot swimming around in here. You're trying the best you can with what you have. I'm trying the best I can with what we have. Let's navigate this together and let's dance. And I just try to go through life that way. But yeah, for those of you who are holding multiple languages in your head, hats off to you. It is a challenge.
Well, thank you, everyone. That's a good note for us to end. On behalf of the Greenville Chamber's 6th Annual DEI Summit and presenting sponsor Michelin North America, I would like to thank you, Kay, all the way from Spain, and you, the audience, for your participation. At this time, you may log out and transition to the next segment of today's summit as per the agenda. This concludes our session. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.